Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's Meeting of the Minds webinar, Life is a Highway, Roadways as Platforms for Innovation. My name is Jessie Feller-Hahn. I'm the Executive Director of Meeting of the Minds. As many of you know, we're a nonprofit global thought leadership network and platform for knowledge sharing with year-round programming. We connect global urban sustainability, innovation, and technology leaders across sectors to share best practices, tools, and solutions through our digital platform, including our webinar series, thought leadership videos, publishing platform, executive cohort program, and virtual convenings. If you find value in the event today or in other events and resources we offer, since we keep a digital platform free and accessible, please consider making a donation at our website, meetingoftheminds.org/donate. We appreciate your support. A few housekeeping notes to begin. Because of our very large audience and attendance today, you will remain muted throughout the event. A recording of today's webinar will be emailed to you after the event for you to share with colleagues that couldn't make it today. You can also find a PDF of today's slides on the website, the event page tomorrow. You will also find in the handout section and on your control panel 5 PDFs, handouts from our presenters that relate to today's presentation for you to take a look at. We'll also post those on the website. We will have a Q&A during the second half of the hour. When you have a question, please type them into the questions panel in your attendee control panel as you think of them. We look forward to having Q&A with all of you to ask questions of Steve Trubner and Steve Hamilton. We would also, of course, appreciate your input regarding today's webinar, so a short survey will pop up when you close your browser at the end of the event. So with that, I'm really pleased to introduce our two presenters today. Steve Trubner is Sales Director in Black & Veatch's Connected Communities Group. He has more than 20 years of experience working with the public sector, specializing in public-private partnerships. He's led a wide range of energy infrastructure and technology deployments across 30 US states. His focus at Black & Veatch is on broadband expansion and intelligent infrastructure solutions with cities, states, and utilities. Prior to his work in the private sector, Steve served in the Colorado Governor's Office and Office of Energy Management. He also has a history of campaign management and public relations. Steve Trubner is joined by Steve Hamilton, so we'll be using their full names today with the two Steves. Steve Hamilton is a senior manager in Deloitte's infrastructure and capital projects practice. He has more than 15 years of experience, not 50, he's not that old, 15 years of experience providing strategic planning and economic assessments for large-scale infrastructure projects for the World Bank Group, national and city governments, and private real estate developers and operators. He's worked in 20 countries spanning Africa, Asia, Middle East, Latin America, Mexico, and the United States. Steve helps to lead Deloitte's work in urban development and smart cities, including advising clients on new business models for shared value capture. Prior to joining Deloitte, Steve worked for AECOM. Steve's also received his master's degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service and his bachelor's degree in foreign affairs from the University of Virginia. So with that, no further ado, Steve Trubner, take it away.
Okay, thanks, Jessie. Can you confirm that you could see the first slide, Life is a Highway?
Looks great.
Great, terrific. Okay, let's get moving. So welcome everyone. I'm Steve Trubner from Black & Veatch, and my colleague that you'll hear from shortly is Steve Hamilton from Deloitte. Looking through our participant lists, very exciting. We have folks from across the country representing a wide range, universities, private businesses, departments of transportation, and plenty of cities. In fact, I think there's over 400 registrants, some of which will be joining live, some of which will be reviewing and watching the webcast after the fact. And in fact, we have folks from overseas, just Portugal, New Zealand, Egypt, to name a few. So if you look at the clock, they might be sound asleep here. So thank you for joining us. Again, Black & Veatch, as a very quick introduction, is an engineering and construction firm. We focus on what we call critical human infrastructure that includes energy, water, and telecommunications. My particular focus is in the telecommunications group. We work with a host of public sector and private sector clients and working through intelligent connected infrastructure projects. Let me introduce my colleague Steve Hamilton, representing Deloitte, and he can share with you just a quick background on his company. Steve?
Yeah, Great. Thank you, first of all, Steve and Jesse, for having Deloitte as part of the event. And it's a great subject, and really thrilled we can be a part of it. Yeah, we are at Deloitte, the largest professional services firm in the world. We serve many Fortune 500 clients, public sector, state, federal, state, city, local governments all over the world. And in particular, my practice that I'm a part of is our infrastructure and capital projects practice, where we help our clients build better and achieve their visions around infrastructure across multiple asset classes: transportation, water, fiber, broadband, vertical assets. We work across them in really close collaboration with our transportation team at Deloitte and our US team, and then focusing on issues like future mobility, future of transit, and really how you get those systems built, operating, and delivering value for public sector and private collaborators. So a lot around public-private partnerships. And have had great opportunities to collaborate with Black and Veatch before, and I'm just thrilled to be here. Thanks, Steve.
Great. Thank you, Steve. Let's see. Moving right along. Okay, so the topic today, life as a highway, roadways as platforms for innovation. Life as a highway, many of you might recognize that, sort of a catchy song title for the webinar, but it does fairly represent many of the themes that we'll be discussing, whether that's life safety, connectivity, education, healthcare, quality of life, even agriculture. Roadways weave through our lives and throughout the country, and as they're reimagined, rebuilt, and enhanced to meet the demands of the future, we're going to talk about what technologies can be embedded, what strategies can be employed to make sure that when we're replacing our grandfather's infrastructure, we're not just replacing it with the same stuff. We're going to talk a little bit about the upcoming federal infrastructure bill, and we're also trying to put that into the context of past infrastructure initiatives in the United States. We'll discuss some macro trends that are driving these change and the adoption of those smart technologies into roadway infrastructure. And finally, we'll share some case studies of active deployments, and then I think we'll have plenty of time for questions and discussions. So no surprise, there's of course a very long history of major infrastructure initiatives in the United States. The common denominator might be that they're all intended to connect Americans and align or realign our economy with the future. Goes way back. President Abraham Lincoln actually had a very early focus, even in the Illinois state legislature, on public works projects and the economic impact. He came to office with a vision of a coast-to-coast railroad network that would bridge farmers to markets and ultimately grow small towns into cities. And what resulted through those initiatives was what we know as the Intercontinental Railroad. President Franklin Roosevelt and his New Deal program may be the most notable infrastructure initiative in U.S. history. It was, of course, born out of the crisis of the Great Depression. And FDR's New Deal was a little bit different focus, but it was intended to put people back to work and connect Americans to the modern society. So there was a high level of focus on massive projects, whether they be airports, bridges, and the delivery of rural electricity. That was central. And we'll talk more about rural electricity in comparison to what we're facing today, rural broadband, and the current administration's initiative. Going forward, President Eisenhower's Interstate Highway Initiative was actually a blend of homeland defense strategy in case our country homeland was attacked, but it was also the result of the emergence and the importance of the automobile. That's a common denominator here in trends toward President Biden's infrastructure bill when you consider the changing geopolitical landscape and all of the technologies that have moved from emerging to essential. The president's infrastructure bill and really some of the components there has been discussed by previous administrations, both parties, in fact, and really there's certainly a dire need to modernize our infrastructure. The president views this effort as transformational and appears to have the political traction as we as a country emerge from the coronavirus pandemic. And as you can see, sometimes it's a need based on technology, and then there's some other driving force, whether that's economic related, in our case, healthcare related, and maybe a combination of both. Nevertheless, the initiative, which is far reaching, is aptly named Build Back Better. And as you can see, U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg does a nice job expressing this, that this really is a once in a lifetime opportunity. And paraphrasing now, but these really are generational efforts. And so if the United States wants to continue to lead the world economy, we can't do it with third-rate infrastructure that doesn't represent or reflect the modern trends of the digital age. So with that, we're going to go a little bit deeper, as I mentioned, into the Federal Infrastructure Initiative. And Steve Hamilton's going to share some thoughts, some detail on this, and some thoughts on how that legislation might begin to play out. Steve?
Absolutely, and Steve, thank you for that. And I'm going to not do any side bets here on a likely date of passage or the exact contours. We know really as much as folks on the call will know that if you just look at the history of infrastructure spending, and in particular federal transfers to state and local governments, over the last decades, it's averaged, give or take, $300 to $400 billion, and then there's been states in-kind contributions through budget, taxation, other means of alternative delivery where you're bringing in private sector through public-private partnerships. But what we see before us now, and will play out over the summer, as the president's bill and the Republican leadership work to hash out common ground, is potentially a substantial increase of federal spending, both through formula programs to the states and then potentially net new grant programs housed at federal agencies. So if you think about departments of transportation, departments of housing, departments of commerce, both at the federal level and then down to the state and local level, really a sea change in terms of the way the federal government sees infrastructure, and as well as its definition. A big part of the discussion right now is what is infrastructure, what is it not? And these numbers are really pretty mesmerizing. You think about it. I mean, 621 billion in terms of transportation infrastructure. So that's clearly highways, rebuilding bridges, upgrading ports, airports, transit systems. I think in particular about $80 billion that would be set aside for transit and light rail. And then utility infrastructure, our energy systems, grid systems. And we need to think no further than the recent cyber hacking and then the pipeline issues, just thinking about the cyber issues around this, building infrastructure. And what I think is really critical here, though, and as profound a moment as it was, as Steve talked about, the change to connect the country, to link rural and urban areas, to basically create this national competitive platform for manufacturing and industry and job growth that goes as far back as Lincoln, and then the public works programs under FDR that remade the nation's infrastructure, the Eisenhower highway system. I think that what the Biden proposal is really a marriage of all of those things, and then taking our definition of infrastructure one step beyond. Clearly, social programs are in the mix, and then if you think about digital connectivity now and our experiences of educating our kids at home, digital health during the many months of the pandemic, just the essentiality of broadband and fiber infrastructure, which is absolutely a new means of connecting the country and industry to our needs as citizens and residents of the country. So it's a profound moment of change. It also moves into childcare potentially. It moves into new forms of energy, renewable manufacturing, the resilience agenda, and then thinking about new forms of compliance around equity and inclusion. It's a really interesting time to be in infrastructure. I think the minority leader, Senator McConnell, has said as recently as the last week that there could be some ground to give around totals, maybe $800 billion potentially on the high end for the Republican offer. And then there's a lot of discussion now around how one pays for this. Is it through taxes on corporation? Is it user fees? We'll leave that to the side around the right optimal mix and levels. But the bottom line is really a redefinition of infrastructure, significant federal spending potentially going to the states, and then a whole bunch of new opportunities, I would say, around new forms of public-private partnership, especially in places like smart infrastructure. So Steve, over to you.
Terrific. Thanks, Steve. That's so important. You talk about the redefinition of infrastructure, ever changing. It will take a while, I think, to truly digest the unprecedented funding and impact that we're looking at here in this situation. So we wanted to talk a little bit. It was Roadways as platforms for innovation around some of the urban highway market trends, and we'll shift over to some rural market trends. We know that departments of transportation, transportation authorities, public and private sector are all looking for ways to position their projects and existing programs to take advantage of the opportunity. And how do you include strategies that can highlight that your infrastructure project has those integrated systems that demonstrate that it's smart, it's flexible, that it's future proof? I'd also say, because of the nature and the cost of transportation projects, when we say smart, it also means trying to identify smarter ways to, and partnership combinations to share in those build costs and responsibilities. So that's a big part of what we'll talk about here. And of course, as we're talking about roadways, you can't talk about roadways without the right-of-way. That has tremendous potential and increasing opportunity to serve as these platforms. Okay, so let's jump right in here and talk about safety and connectivity. We've already touched on some themes like quality of life, time, traffic management, because they really do all go hand in hand. And currently, the deployment of intelligent transportation systems is really that central platform to manage all of this incoming data and information, enabling those data-driven decisions and new strategies. ITS systems, intelligent transportation systems, are being deployed across the country at different scales. Some may be focused on intersections within cities, some may be focused on key highway corridors, but in general, we're moving quickly from planning to adoption and large-scale deployment. And some of the technologies we start to see firsthand more and more, whether that's smart signage, variable speed signage, vehicle to infrastructure connectivity, real-time roadway sensors. And we're talking urban here, but many of the most dangerous roads are actually rural. There's an important component there. Route planning, vehicle to vehicle communication, we're going to touch on several times in this discussion. But in general, what we have here is that for these systems to really reach their full capabilities, it is consistent, reliable, low latency connectivity that's going to be an essential building block. And how do these particular transportation authorities do this? They're facing decreasing gas tax revenue and really increasingly looking for those particular solutions. We see more and more, whether state legislatures or cities, discussing tolling strategies, usage fees, public-private partnerships. All of this is trying to find smarter ways to build and advance. Another macro trend we thought would be interesting to point out and discuss is e-commerce. That's probably not a surprise to anyone, but it's been on the rapid and steady incline for years. The pandemic actually accelerated that growth, but now we're looking at what's called permanent behavior change, that it might have spiked that particular growth, but we will probably level off and stay or continue to increase, but we've seen a big jump. And that, considering that goods reaching the consumer, over 80% of these goods are on a truck at some point. So you take that trucking industry and put it right there in the middle of a major change, whether it's the shipping demand. Trucking industry is dealing with a worldwide driver shortage. There's the prospect of trucking only highway usage fees, and then all of the different technologies that are emerging for vehicles are also applied to trucks. One of the technologies that we're referencing here is truck platooning, and this is sort of a foundational layer. This is maybe that first step that takes you towards autonomous trucks. But the truck platooning is a process in which trucks roll together, locked into speed and formation, and finding efficiency in that process. it's still driver operated, and vehicle to vehicle communication is the key. Autonomous trucks is still down the road, so to speak. But again, we go back to that reliable roadway connectivity is going to be essential for e-commerce trend and the delivery of these particular goods. How can we do it smarter? How can we do it more sustainable? How can we be more efficient? Next point here, there's really undeniable trend around electric vehicles and renewable energy. So how do those trends impact roadway innovation? Well, for one, charging infrastructure and EV strategies, Steve Hamilton went over this a little bit, is going to continue to be a big part of the current legislative package. And at the high level, the more charging opportunity, whether that's at home, office, or on the roads we drive on through dynamic wireless charging, all of this is going to continue to drive consumer confidence in the EV driving experience. There's some really fascinating projects actually in Israel and in Sweden that are embedding long haul wireless charging infrastructure into the roads. And some of these are actually specific back to the trucking, really creating a truck only right of way just for automated electric trucking. Some very interesting things as we see the conversion there. And a couple other points, at least on the renewable side. The Federal Highway Administration recently provided some additional guidelines on alternative use of highway right-of-way. They define those public good activities as renewable energy, electric vehicle, charging stations, broadband. All sound very familiar to our discussion. So right now there is some pioneering right-of-way solar deployment, and several departments of transportation, Oregon, Massachusetts, Utah come to mind, are really considered early adopters. Most of these particular projects produce energy to support their own operations, which is terrifically smart. But the next step is sort of finding the right recipe of partners and finance so that these solar deployments can reach the utility scale capacity and sell power back to the grid. When we talk about privately funded bridges or tollways, so much of that is supported by those guaranteed revenue sources. And finally, this is really sort of the underpinning technology or infrastructure, if you will, fiber. And the key enabler to so much of this is fiber backhaul along the roadways. There are some predictions actually that in 25 years that a single automated vehicle could consume up to 500 gigabits per month. Thinking about that in comparison, on the high end, that's actually pretty close to the average US household today. So as we go through this process, as we go through this change and adoption of all of the technology, so much of that data will be moved towards the edge. And there's going to be critical partnerships that emerge from small cell and 5G deployment. Also just trying to sort of work through all of those particular technologies, because as these intelligent vehicles become more and more ever present on the roads, there's a constant need for communication with the shifting environment around them. So they say that smart cities run on fiber. I think the same is going to be true for highways. We're going to flip it back to Steve Hamilton, and Steve's going to talk a little bit about the rural roadway market trends. Steve?
Yeah, great. Thank you so much, Steve. It's just, it's really incredible to think about the digital and technological innovation that is now occurring in the nation's highways and the private partnerships that are being forged. And I think the other big question is if you expand beyond urban areas and you think about peri-urban areas or rural areas, there's always been this question about, is technology infrastructure, is it felt across the country? Are smaller communities in the United States being left behind? And I think this unique moment in time allows us to think about, okay, in what ways can this infrastructure, the backhaul you're talking about, the other opportunities around building once and building new infrastructure will enable smaller towns, less dense communities, agricultural rural areas to be connected, and just the criticality of that now. Again, as the father of 3 kids, I often think about what the last year was like, trying to have enough broadband capacity at my home in a New England community. But if you think about, in particular, the ability to leverage those partnerships and those new use cases in rural areas, I think it's worth spending a moment on that. So, for example, think through education, e-delivery of education, the likelihood that in the future there may again be some sort of pandemic or disruptive event that we need to work through. We need to make sure that the capacity exists so that education outcomes are sustained across the country, and that children have both the capacity and the latency necessary to basically have core curriculum delivered. Absolutely critical issue, and something that I think can be solved with innovation and public-private partnership in communities across the United States, especially where there's now tens of billions of dollars of potential broadband and fiber investment that is now on the table. And then how do you create new forms of partnership with the service providers around this as well to be able to deliver those outcomes? And then I think obviously there's a big question about hybrid campus models. So if you think about what's the amount of time that you spend in a school or a higher education campus, the facility footprint, the cost of real estate, that's all being adjusted as well because it gets translated to the cost of attendance. And then how do you think about hybrid and connected campuses as well that have access to the needed infrastructure? Critical issues. I think too about health. I think about in particular the last year, seeing doctors over, some people over their phones or seeing doctors at home. E-delivery of health is of increasing importance. And again, is there a way in which the new infrastructure agenda it provides the capacity and throughput, solving more of the mid-mile challenge, and certainly thinking about the challenge of last-mile connectivity to be able to deliver health outcomes when distance is required. And then if you think too about what it enables in terms of drones, medical services, shipping, delivery, around products that need to be delivered just in time, or products that need to be refrigerated, and get drones to those communities to deliver those services and goods. Absolutely critical enabling infrastructure as well. And then I think finally, if you think about the overall, a big question mark is, you mentioned a lot about the trade, freight platooning, what that does in terms of speeding up goods to market, and what it does in terms of really the bottom line, translating to the bottom line of agro industry and farmers across the United States. One example is the Arizona border region, where roughly 90% of our leafy greens come through that region, through Sonora, and grown in that region. And the big question there is, how do you create the infrastructure that enables the platooning you're talking about, or the dedicated laneways? And through conversations with farmers and others over the years, understood that there was just a lack of broadband capacity, throughput, and issues around latency that prohibited things like analytics around irrigation, analytics around pests, drones again, the whole question of drones for monitoring crops. And the more we layer in these capabilities and layer in these use cases around smart farming, precision farming, targeted strategies around data and analytics for irrigation, to prevent crop spoilage, get crops to market faster. There's a real economic imperative that underlies all this. So I'll stop there, Steve, but it's an exciting time if we think about not just the core asset of the road, but the use cases and what it enables around it.
That's terrific. Thanks, Steve. I think you made some excellent points, and I'm looking forward to coming back to some of those in the question and answer part of the webinar here. I'll share with our host that I am keeping my eye on the clock. We do have 3 case studies that we thought we would discuss here. We'll probably try and streamline these next 3 topics here, and then if the opportunity arises in the Q&A, maybe there's some dialogue that trends back towards some of these as examples. When we talk about, of course, that fiber network, we think a terrific example is the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission. So the over 500 miles of turnpike, one of some of the busiest areas of the East Coast. Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission has built, with Black & Veatch and key partners, a 220-mile fiber network, partially going north from out of Philadelphia, and the other portion west. So focused on some of those key areas. The primary driver here is to be able to sort of move towards electric automated tolling, expand and enhance the intelligent transportation systems, and be at the ready for those other emerging technologies that are going to make the most sense for the turnpike users. Now, this is what we describe as long haul fiber. And one of the particular features of this, and sometimes if you think about it, right of ways are going to go through rivers, through rock, through ravines. There's a micro trenching technology which really kind of cuts along the right of way in the existing roadway, which is an important feature of this that enabled much of this sort of long haul fiber deployment there. Anyway, this sets up Pennsylvania, and Steve and I have both touched on some of the different use cases, but now Pennsylvania and those surrounding communities around that particular turnpike are now going to be able to take advantage, and there's all sorts of partnership and innovative possibilities there. Next up is the San Diego Association of Governments. You might hear us refer to that as SANDAG. To put it in perspective, and I'm going to just give a bit, just very high level, why we're talking about this, how it started, and then I'll ask Steve to pick up from there, maybe give a little bit more information on what they call the 5 big moves. But generally, SANDAG is made up of 18 cities and a series of different governments. It's not just what you think in terms of San Diego. I at least think of the sort of downtown area, the airport right there, planes flying low over the head. But what's so interesting about this is that it really does encapsulate rural, suburban, and urban needs. And so as the San Diego Association of Governments was looking to put together what would be a blueprint or a master plan for transportation related initiatives that were going to meet their sustainability goals, they took on what we think is a tremendously smart and forward-thinking approach that looks at everything from climate, connectivity, housing, parking, and allows them to make those smart infrastructure decisions. And so much about this is about connectivity. And that when you're building something, you're building it as smart and as strategic as you can. And as you see there, one of the 5 big moves, Next OS, meaning operating system. But Steve, why don't I pass it over to you if you want to just give a couple minutes on SANDAG here.
Yeah, that's perfect. I'll try to move a little quickly, just bearing in mind the time. But yeah, we've been, as you know, Steve, we've been very involved with the Next OS, using a dynamic digital twin modeling capability that allows for real dynamic modeling around behaviors of transit, people driving cars, solar connected vehicles, to do really kind of informed scenario planning in real time, bringing in thousands upon thousands of data points. So whether it's how moving a road might change behavior around car use or single occupant vehicles, how a regional transit adjustment might again change how people use the roads or use transit itself. SANDAG's been very innovative around testing and modeling around the regional planning, and then as well, kind of building this again integrated regional approach to the Next OS and mobility operating system, which for a MPO of its size and scale is a truly innovative place to be. So both with in terms of really dynamic thinking around planning and how one plans around transport and mode and transit modes and how it adjusts and impacts regional behavior, then right through to kind of articulating around this next mobility operating system. It's a really interesting environment for sure. And I think we go one more, right? And I'll just very right. Happy to. Oh yeah, very happy to just discuss this. But we've recently, with the Arizona Partnership of Economic Innovation, launched the Arizona Mobility Innovation Zone. And really what it is to do, it's the private and public sector. It's coming together around a tremendous amount of mobility and transportation, both business investment and and really innovative regulation and at the state of Arizona level and within the MPOs and the transportation agencies within the state around creating an open environment for mobility testing, whether you're thinking about AV testing for individuals, or you're thinking about potentially through the I-10 and the border regions, testing for autonomous freight. Those are just two small examples, but what the AZ-MIZ seeks to do is bring together other actors, willing participants who wish to invest in kind of a governance model that, again, works alongside the existing efforts of the state in terms of the Institute for Automated Mobility at ACA and others. So right now we're kind of architecting the vision. We're looking at the use cases that solve kind of the most pressing needs of the region, right from the Pima region right up through to Greater Phoenix. And we're working with those, in the early days of working with those public partners to get to design the overall the business model from moving forward, where the private sector come together in a regional basis, building upon the existing efforts underway by institutions such as the Connective, the mobility efforts underway at ASU. And so one thing we did want to leave everyone with is that we'd love to hear from you. Those of us in Arizona working on this vision and working on the inventory and the use cases and building upon the existing efforts. This is meant to be a coalition of the willing and really create opportunity for sustained scalability of mobility innovation at a regional level. So I'll stop there, Steve. And again, thank you, B&V, and thank Jesse at Meeting of the Minds and team for having us on this journey with you.
That's great, Steve. This is truly exciting, and I think that we've covered some good ground here. And I hope from both a high level strategy deployment standpoint that we've given the group some information, and we can take some questions. Jesse, can you hear me? And would you like to sort of moderate that? And would you like us to turn on our cameras? How would you like to do this next portion?
Yes, let's share our webcam so you guys can see our beautiful faces. We'll just do it. We're going to move into our Q&A, and you guys, our audience, we can type your questions into the questions control panel on the right of your screen. We have some already in there. And as we get those, we will, have a great conversation. So Steve Trubner, I know you had a question though for Steve Hamilton to kick us off. You want to do that one now?
Yeah, sure. That is, so Steve's pointed out something that I thought was interesting, and I did talk a little bit, talked at length about the history of U.S. infrastructure and what some of those driving forces, whether it was geopolitical or whether it was technology. But what also is there is that there's sort of a continual redefinition of infrastructure. Maybe that's natural, but I see that certainly is something that's happening under this administration, and childcare might be something that is now being defined as infrastructure, because it is, how do you go to work without having that service? I thought that was a really interesting piece. I know Steve sort of touched on some of that, but wanted to get his thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, again, this last year, not being on the road as much as I typically am, and having three young children, twin 10-year-old daughters at home for us for the good part of the year, and then a 3.5-year-old running around, joining many conference calls, better connected at Deloitte than I am now, I think. It just shows you that how linked our requirements as families are in terms of being able to do our jobs. And I think before there was a clearer delineation, but now there's been more of a blending of personal home and work. But I've often thought about it, in terms of this is a unique moment, and I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from it. But it's absolutely true. However we pivot back, whatever the future work model is, it is very hard to I'd say maintain the level of work to be able to take care of your family. And if you don't have childcare that's accessible, if you don't have other support networks, family, friends, it can create a challenge. I've seen some statistics. Again, the disproportionate impact on women's careers during the pandemic, who were actually not only doing their full-time job as they always do, as I've seen with my own wife, but then also bearing the brunt of ongoing education. That cannot but sit with you. And again, it's not a political statement. I think it's something society needs to reckon with broadly. But there's certain views of the world where that should be treated as infrastructure. There's other views of the world where that should be treated as a social policy issue and separated out. But it's clearly, to me, my thinking, an issue and something that the pandemic has had a light on.
Thanks.
That's good information. Yeah, think about it as is tough to delineate critical infrastructure and human infrastructure. And in fact, as I was going through some of the history, I did not talk about President Johnson in the Great Society, just trying to focus on some of the critical infrastructure. But 50 years later, there's much more. Those two are much closer aligned at this point.
Yeah. Great. Thanks, you guys. Stephen Goldsmith. Hi, Stephen. It's been a while since I've seen you in person. Ask the question, maybe Steve Trubner for you first, and then Steve Hamilton. I know you'll have something to say about this as well. But Stephen Goldsmith saying, with so much federal money flowing through the system, how do you think the role of P3s will change or are changing in generating innovation and add-on investments for cities and states? So P3 potential, Steve Trubner, you're a P3 guy. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I may bias, and thanks for the question, Steve, and good to see you again. I think it's central to the solution, and we are talking about so many different technologies and a ecosystem of different players and partners that would be necessary to either defray the cost or come up with a shared risk model, that this really seems to be the right path and maybe the most efficient way to do it. Now, that being said, if those particular efforts, when it comes to the federal funding, there's so much preparation that needs to be done. And actually, we share with our clients, and we sort of work through a road mapping process. Some of it's fact finding, some of it's sort of creating a strategy and a roadmap, and how would we go through this. But the months that we have here going through summer, I think, are going to be so critical for those entities that see some of the technologies that they know are important to them. They may see a particular path. How do they best position their particular programs, projects to blend in some of that public money with perhaps private investment in some sort of combination that's going to have the most impact for their particular community or enterprise? Steve, I'd be interested in your thoughts.
Yeah, I don't think I'd add too much more. I think Steve Goldsmith, it's great to hear from you again. The fundamental question is project preparation, and I think the issue really is, if this money comes down as Stephen mentioned, and at the quantums we expect it might, are the public agencies prepared with a list of prioritized projects that are sufficiently defined with a sufficient business case, whatever the delivery model, traditional, P3, and are, in some of the states in particular, are the legislative and regulatory models going to change to make P3s viable? And I think that's a question too. So I think it's one of capacity. It's one, having the right business case together, being prepared as an entity, and then is there, not shovel ready. I think that's been overused. But are there enough prepared projects far enough developed where the risks are sufficiently understood at this stage, and the risk and reward trade-offs that the private sector is willing to partner with the public sector, whatever the mix of money, federal, state, local, private, what have you. So I do think it all comes down to business case planning, preparedness, capacity to manage the amount of money that might be coming down, and then again, the legal regulatory environment.
Great. And Steve Hamilton, another question for you from Peter Thompson. He's saying, globally speaking, there are many countries that have built really successful public-private partnership pipelines in the infrastructure space. Which countries are you looking to at Deloitte to help resolve the historical failure to execute here in the US? Great question, Peter. Steve Hamilton, thoughts?
Yeah, so thank you for that question, Peter. I mean, we often look to kind of, our Australian practice, our Canadian colleagues who have very deep, especially on the transportation transit side, have very deep capabilities. And where frankly, the issue there is that there is not there's a relative paucity of competing regulatory legal environment, and there's just a longer track record of bringing private capital to bear to solve some of these private expertise and private alternative delivery models. So really models and then private expertise and capital to bear. So definitely those markets. I think other markets in Europe, and I think it depends on the asset class as well. So transportation, water in Australia, Canada, very strong focus on transportation as well, where I tend to spend most of my time. But other parts of Europe are also doing more around social infrastructure. And so I think there's many different places to choose from. And I don't think there's one size fits all. You got to look at the environment, the deal, and really the mechanics of the market.
Great. Anything to add, Steve Trubner? Do you want to say anything beyond?
Oh, I think Steve hit all the high notes. We are talking about the sort of convergence of so many different technologies, but in the prism of transportation, and we know that at least transportation authorities are no stranger to public-private partnerships. That there is, in many cases, most cases, enabling legislation, some experience, and it may be easier than carving or blazing a new trail. That there is some good precedence there, and I think finding the right model. Steve pointed out some good international ones, but finding the right ingredients for that particular recipe that's going to work. It's a tailored process, and preparation, early preparation is the key.
Great. I'm going to combine Jeremy Glover and Luke Fabian both have questions about the cost of maintenance. So Steve Trubner, maybe, they're thinking about the life cycle cost impacts of adding fiber to the interstate system. States are already unable to pay maintenance costs of the overbuilt system we already have. Or do you have thoughts about what shared revenue models need to be reviewed to ensure the roadway infrastructure is maintained and upgraded in this new round of infrastructure building?
So if I'm hearing you correctly, the question is around the operations and maintenance costs of the fiber network itself.
Yes, exactly. How do we, once we build it, who's maintaining it, who's paying for it?
Good. Well, yeah, I would think it's an excellent question. I'm glad it was asked. In none of these efforts is there I believe that the long term is always in mind. So it's not just finding the right mix of partners and financial opportunity to build the project and walk away. Often there is a blend of responsibility as well as risk for those particular networks. As we were talking about within the Pennsylvania Turnpike Commission, there is a operations and maintenance component to that, and there's also a blend of partners that are going to be marketing that particular dark fiber, finding the right future revenue partners and opportunities that they can pull that in. The Illinois Department of Transportation has really done a nice job there. So there is always a plan that's in place to make sure that the public entity is not saddled with O&M. It's just finding the right balance there of partners and anticipated timeline when you're going to hit those revenue targets.
Great. And Steve Hamilton, are there any creative maintenance funding models you've seen either in the US or abroad that you think we could all learn from?
That's a great question. I'll have to put my head to that a little bit. I think it depends on the asset class and the private participation model. But that's something we'll come back to you on. I think we do have some thoughts to share, but I don't want to go way out on a wing. I think Steve covered it pretty well, especially in the fiber side.
Okay, great. And also there's in the handout section, and we'll post this on the website event page, is a case study of the Pennsylvania Turnpike. So perhaps you guys are interested in looking at that. It's in the handout section of the control panel, but we'll be sure to put that on the website as well. And John Stewart is asking, Can all this work be linked into FAST Act reauthorization? Any thoughts about that, Steve Trubner?
Well, I do believe that what is a important consideration, or the timing is of the FAST Act expiration, is tied to the infrastructure funding from a transportation standpoint. That they may not go hand in hand, but the timing is not a coincidence. So again, I think sort of building the bridge between those. Building the bridge may be a poor term. Making sure that the initiatives that are already underway or being funded can be picked up and can be enhanced with some of the new direction that the Federal Highway Administration is providing, as well as from a political standpoint, what we know the spirit and the goals of connected infrastructure is going to look like.
Great. Question from Duke Ryder. Hi, Duke. It's been, you were like the last person we saw in person at our annual summit before the pandemic. Duke's asking, maybe actually Steve Trubner, over to you first, and then Steve Hamilton. He said this may have already been addressed, so respond as appropriate. But how will electrification of our highways be resolved effectively given the multiple vendors and interests, not all of which are compatible sometimes? Can the I-10, for instance, be a laboratory for this issue, given that it's already that it already is such for autonomous trucking, et cetera? Question about I-10, Steve Trubner, and competing interest vendors.
Great. It is the I-10 corridor in Arizona is I'm glad that you pointed that out. At one point in my remarks where I was talking about e-commerce and trucking, Amazon, and how do you talk about e-commerce without talking about Amazon? But they really have some very forward-thinking trucking deployment strategies, pilots and tests going on in that same particular corridor there. There is an entity called the I believe it's called the Autonomous Institute. But one of the critical themes that they do talk about is how do you make sure that there is a proper set of standards and that there is connectivity, that when you're going from jurisdiction to jurisdiction, because it may not just be, you simply can't have a breakdown between service providers or particular carriers if cellular is the primary connectivity. So as we're building this out in longer and longer stretches, we're going to be reaching that point in terms of setting standards that jump from jurisdiction to jurisdiction and maintain that all of the connectivity from infrastructure to vehicle and vehicle to vehicle, that there's no gap.
Great. Steve Hamilton, any extra thoughts on the I-10, which goes across many states? Thoughts on how to use that corridor as a test bed, or it's already doing autonomous trucking?
I just think, bearing in mind enabling legislation across the states, for example, Arizona with the smart highways legislation, and I think creating a connective regulatory environment, not just one that's technology oriented, is absolutely critical. And different departments and parts of government at the city and local levels as well have to be bought into this. And I think it's also sharing the value capture.
Okay, great. Steve Trubner, back to you. Question from David Legger. The South Bay Cities COG, South Bay area of Los Angeles County, built a regional fiber network connecting 15 cities, LA County Public Works Department, and LA Metro. Do you have any tips on working with city staff to develop innovative transportation projects, thinking outside the box here?
That's great, and Los Angeles, or at least the LA sort of public works community and multiple governments, not the only one facing this. I think that with some of the other metro areas that we're working with, some of the focus is determining what do the fiber assets really look like? Are there any additional enhancements or connectivity that need to be made? But then there's also something that has been discussed, that you can't build a fiber network without putting some marketing behind it. So it's also coming up with a strategic marketing plan that matches up with what we know might be happening in that particular area. There's also a discussion around smart city as a service. And sometimes that's tied to the term, build it and they will come. 5, 6, 7 years ago, many of the smart city technologies were sort of the driving force, but it was difficult to pick and choose the winners and then determine how those particular sensors would be communicating. If there is a fiber network that's available, and even through the deployment of small cells and the creation of an LTE network that might be able to enable some of these sensors, there's some good opportunities around third-party data gathering. We know so much of what's going on in terms of public safety sensors and communications. But what I see that some of the communities that are making good progress is they tend to zero in on what I call the 311 network, which is what are those constituents, what are those citizens complaining about? And if you think outside of the box, you might think about littering, for example. It often happens in the same alleyway, on the same turn of road where there's not lighting. Trash buildup on the corner of someone's yard. So there are ways to mix in a sensor gathering, information gathering, and start to address those. And if you're addressing some of those immediate particular items that are central or on the radar for those citizens, I think you're going to see a positive response and good growth.
Great. Fantastic. Well, we only have a few minutes left, and I'm going to ask one last question of you, Steve Trubner. Do you know of any projects that, this is from Michael Shear, mapping the now visible distributed workforce in an effort to identify clusters that can be better served as a technology node on a secure fiber regional backbone? So I guess question about workforce, clusters, regional fiber. What are you seeing in that space?
Well, that's you promised no chin music. That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah, I may have a follow-up question to clarify on that particular piece, and so I'd welcome to my email as part of the presentation to reach out and have that conversation. I'm not quite sure how this pertains to workforce, but cities are actively and with more and more frequency looking for those opportunities where they can take their existing fiber infrastructure, find the right partner that can help deploy from a neutral host standpoint some of that wireless technology that may not be available in particular pockets. And I'm not just talking about public Wi-Fi availability. I'm talking about focusing in on some of those particular areas of town. There's some really interesting case studies there. The CBRS spectrum has opened up some new doors. So I'd look forward to maybe continuing that conversation if I could zero in on some additional detail. But all in all, I guess is a theme to what we've been talking about for the last hour, how important that fiber infrastructure is and what that can do. So there's the partnerships to build it, and then there's all sorts of opportunities that emerge from that point forward.
Yeah, we're definitely at an inflection point.
Michael
Shear, yes, Michael Shear, his Steve Trubner and Steve Hamilton, for everyone, their emails are up on this last slide, which is why I've kept it up. And you, instead of seeing our huge webcam faces, I wanted to keep that up for you guys if you guys had questions. But that is all the time we have today. So a short survey is going to pop up when you close your browser. We really appreciate your input. We take it very seriously. And we thank you so much, Steve Trubner and Steve Hamilton, for being part of this webinar today. And great to see some old friends in the Q&A. And so that concludes our session for today. So have a great day. And thank you, Steve and Steve.
Thank you, Meeting of the Minds. Appreciate it.
Talk to you guys soon.
Thank you, Jesse. Thanks.
You're welcome. Talk to you guys all soon.